And I just want to make sure it's going to.
You're right.
That's okay.
You're welcome.
Did you plan the match today?
It's not too
Did you and just plan the match today?
No, I set it up so like they can't talk to us. But they can't put in questions and things like that. So, you never know.
Of course you do.
Yeah, that's a lot of questions today. I have plenty of opportunities and I'm full of questions.
We'll find out. So that. Maybe.
Well, welcome, guys. Thank you for coming out for this Federal Reserve Symposium. I'm Nicholas Fisher, teaching business law. Some of you are from my classes, some of you are from other classes. We wish to welcome our faculty, Dee Morgan and Dr. Dusick, Dr. Hammerker, saw PJ. PJ's right there. So thanks for coming out for our symposium. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Nathan Kauffman. He is the Senior Vice President of the Omaha branch, executive, and then from the Federal Reserve Bank from Kansas City. He received his Bachelor of Science in Chemistry from Malone University in Canton, Ohio, and then received his PhD in Economics from Iowa State University in 2012. He has a background in economic and community development with the Mennonite Central Committee, and he started off as an economist with the Federal Reserve before moving into his current roles. So thank you for coming up, and I'll turn the time over to you, sir.
Yeah, thanks, and good to meet all of you. Thanks for, so this is the second week of classes, right? So you're kind of just easing into the fall semester. We're gonna start right off with the Federal Reserve Symposium. So I'm sure there's gonna be questions too. So I always hear this when people introduce me about the connection between chemistry and economics, so we can hopefully answer some of that later. How many people, though, just by background and familiarity, have you heard of the Federal Reserve? Show of hands. So just out of curiosity, because I like to ask this question, what are your impressions? What are some things that come to mind when you hear Federal Reserve?
Stock market.
Stock market, okay. What else?
Interest rate.
Interest rates. Anything else?
Jackson Hole.
Jackson Hole, okay. Good timing on that one. So, by the way, there's no, there's wrong answers, but there's no, real wrong answer. I like to ask that question just because when I've interacted with people, there's often not actually a lot of great understanding about who the Federal Reserve is and what we do, except that you maybe hear bits and pieces from time to time. So all of that is fair. My intent here is to give a little bit of an overview of what we do, which hopefully you'll find useful as you go through some of your classes, or especially for anyone that's thinking about stuff in business, economics, finance, any of those areas. I'm a little bit biased having a degree in economics, that I think it's a degree that's useful in a lot of other places too, but I'm not going to talk for a long time. I'm hopefully just going to give you an overview, and then we'll be interested in hearing questions of things that you all might be wondering a little bit about. We can just have maybe some of a conversation. Just to get to know people in the room a little bit better too, maybe by show of hands, how many people are seniors? Juniors? Sophomore? Freshman? Okay, so mostly between sophomore and how many would be, I'm not gonna ask for every major, but let's say business, finance, somewhere in there, accounting. Okay, those of you that didn't raise your hands, what are some other majors that people are pursuing? Ag business. Okay, what else? Okay, so ag biz. Maybe there's some others that are in different places too. So let me I'll just by way of introduction say a little bit about who I am, why I'm here, and then maybe a little bit about the Fed, and then I'm going to stop talking and see what questions people might have. The comment earlier, so stock market or interest rates or something along those lines, those are all related to stuff that we do at the Federal Reserve. So a lot of people maybe know, like I said, bits and pieces. When we say the Federal Reserve, what we mean is the central bank for the United States. And that's not always being pointed that I should go this way.
We're in the center.
More in the center? Okay, this is better? Okay, all right, thanks. The Federal Reserve is the central bank for the United States, and there's maybe not always a strong understanding of exactly what that is when we say we are the central bank, because it's not just one building or one entity. So when you go through your courses that are dealing with economics and business, or it's talking about interest rates, it's important to understand some of the institutions and structure behind that. So the Federal Reserve is actually a combination of a couple of different entities. How many people have heard the name Jay Powell? Okay, so you've probably heard more Janet Yellen or Ben Bernanke or people before Jay Powell. A lot of people know those individuals. Jay Powell now, but previous to Jay Powell, they're in Washington, D.C. with an institution that we call the Board of Governors. This is all part of the Federal Reserve System. I am from the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, and the Kansas City Fed would be one of 12 what we call regional reserve banks that are scattered throughout the country. And I'm even more specifically located in our Omaha branch office. So my job on a pretty regular basis is to try as best I can to understand what's happening in the economy in Nebraska and represent the state of Nebraska on behalf of the Federal Reserve. So I'm an economist by background. I got my degree at Iowa State. And some of what we do that is research. So we use data. We try to understand what's happening in different segments of the economy. Agriculture is actually a big part of that. But then part of it is also just visiting communities, better understanding what sorts of things might be different in Omaha relative to Chadron, Scottsbluff, McCook, take your pick. And that is all intended then so that we can provide input more broadly that rolls into more of a national discussion. So if you see headlines and surely you've seen headlines connected between the stock market and other things related to Jay Powell, especially recently, that you understand that there's actually more discussion that happens behind that, even if what you're seeing is a headline that might be specific to one thing. There's actually a lot of input that comes from Nebraska and other parts that go into all of those discussions. So I'll just real quick, because I don't want to bore you, although I do know this is a class, so hopefully it's helpful that you have a little bit of context in terms of what the Fed does and what it looks like. We often talk about three specific things that the Federal Reserve is engaged with. The one that most people are most familiar with, and it was mentioned in a couple of comments here, is monetary policy. So this is interest rates. The Federal Reserve sets interest rates. It's actually a fairly specific interest rate that the Federal Reserve sets. And that has effects on the broad economy everywhere. So we can talk a little bit more about what that looks like, but that's one of the main things that the Fed is involved in and what most people know usually about the Fed. Another one is bank supervision. So if you go around town and you see a bank, or you have a checking account at a bank, or you take out a loan for a car or a house or whatever it is, you're doing that at a bank, and there are institutions in place, the Federal Reserve being one of those, that are responsible for making sure that those banks are sound, that they are operating in a manner that's not going to put people at risk, it's not going to put people's money at risk, and so forth. So we have people whose responsibility it is to supervise banks. And by the way, part of the reason I'm explaining some of the things that we do, and part of the reason actually for coming here, for visiting with you all, is that we want you all as students to know about potential opportunities, whether it's with the Federal Reserve or even outside of the Fed system, that you say, I actually didn't know about that, or I'd like to learn a little bit more about that, or I didn't know that kind of job was available, or that internship was available. So let me ask my counselor advisor a little bit more about it, professors a little bit more about it, and then hopefully that you can all see some of those potential opportunities. So I'm mentioning some of the things that we do in part because if you find yourself pursuing a degree or a major that is in any of those areas, then maybe that's on your radar going forward. So monetary policy being one that's most visible, bank supervision. The other is financial services and payments. So we actually, the Federal Reserve is the bank for the United States government. And so the Treasury, the United States Treasury, is a customer of ours, meaning that we process lots and lots of payments that go through the US Treasury. So there's a lot of work that kind of sits behind the scenes that most people wouldn't be familiar with, that would be part of that financial infrastructure. We have at the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City about 2,000 employees and about 150 at our office in Omaha. What do you all think is, I ask this question because usually, not just because people get it wrong, but it surprises people sometimes. What do you think is the largest profession or division that we would have at the Kansas City Fed, the most common job? What do you think it is?
Sort of communications type role, like making messages across each other, making calls, etc.
Sure, communications. So we do have a communications department. It's, I would say, relatively small. It's not the largest, but we have a communications team. What else do you think?
Auditors.
What was it?
Auditors.
Auditors, yeah. So for so if you're in bank supervision, people who are examining banks, doing audit, anything that relates to financials. That's a relatively large area. It's probably in general, it's probably the second largest. This doesn't need to be Family Feud, but what do you think is the first one? Any guesses? So so again, 2,000 employees, and I think about 800 or 900 are in this area. You're gonna know it when I say it. IT. 800 or 900 in IT. So when you think about, and we can take some of this during Q&A too, when you think about the way our economy operates and how much of that happens digitally and electronically, you can start to see that even the payments that get processed through US Treasury and other things, we sometimes think about our government entities as being these old institutions that everything happens, you know, by Pony Express or something, but a lot of this is happening electronically. So anything that happens through a payments platform or financial services, and even thinking about banks, my guess is, how many people have been to a bank in the last month? That's actually more than I thought. Okay, so, but for most people, you're doing most of your financial transactions through some app that you have on your phone. Most of the payments that get sent from one place to another are happening electronically. So when you think about the work that's required to maintain all of that, there are people that need to develop those apps. They need to understand cybersecurity. They need to make sure that they are up to speed on whatever, you know, latest program or something might be available. People that are actually building devices, you know, that's one of the jobs. So IT is actually a pretty large area of what we have. So I mentioned that in part to give you a sense of how our workforce has evolved, as I'm sure lots of others have too, where IT has become a bigger part. So again, just to give you a little bit of framework of who we are. So I'll describe maybe real quick, kind of some of the work that we're involved in, and then I'm going to stop talking and see what questions people might have. I'm an economist by background. I've been at the Fed since 2012, so going on, it's 12 now, going on 13 years. And like I said, a big part of what my responsibility is to make sure I'm doing as much as I can to both understand what's happening in Nebraska's economy, but then also relay that information to people so that there's sort of a two-way flow of communication. We want people to understand how we think about things at the Fed, but then through those interactions, we're able to get information from businesses and communities across the state. So I'll meet regularly with businesses and ask questions like, how does your hiring compare to last year? Or what are some of the challenges you're facing? What are some of the risks? How do interest rates factor into your decisions? Those sorts of questions are important for us to then understand what's happening with respect to the economy. So you can imagine that probably the most significant topic as you start thinking about what the Federal Reserve does has been inflation. As you start going through your coursework and you're learning about the Fed, or maybe you already have, if you've taken any version of macro or probably even microeconomics, is that what you'll occasionally come across when it comes to the Federal Reserve, and more specifically monetary policy, interest rates, is what the Fed is responsible for when it comes to inflation and the economy. So we have what we often describe at the Fed as a dual mandate, which means that our responsibility is to construct policies that would hopefully be conducive to the maximum employment growth possible over the long term. So policies would give people as many opportunities to find jobs as possible. That's kind of the idea behind that. But as you know, in economics, you know, usually when you move one thing, something else moves too. And so if the economy is really strong, usually what that means is inflation on the other side of it. So the Fed and the US economy and every industry for the most part in the US economy has been dealing with inflation that we haven't seen for, 40 plus years. So a lot of what the Fed has been focusing on is to try to understand conditions and how businesses might be positioned. Are we starting to see inflation ease a little bit? Is it still a pressure? What's the right policy path to ensure that you're kind of finding the right balance between employment and inflation? And so again, my job is to maybe more specifically focus on Nebraska. We actually at the Kansas City Fed also play a national role when it comes to agriculture. So when there are questions, and you might understand that knowing what this region looks like, that the Kansas City Fed would provide some of that leadership for the Federal Reserve more broadly when it comes to ag. So those are some of the things that we spend a lot of time thinking about. How is inflation evolving? How are businesses hiring? Are they not? What are they doing with salaries and wages? And all of those things help us get a better sense of the things that we should be describing that feed into ultimately policy decisions. So we can talk about what all of that looks like, but I wanted to just give you kind of a big picture description of what we do and why. And the reason, so being here in Chadron, I was mentioning earlier, we have a board of directors that works with us in Omaha. And it's 7 people from across the state representing businesses that I'm sure many of you have heard of if I were to say them. And these individuals we would gather on a regular basis to ask questions that I just mentioned. So tell me what you're doing with hiring, tell me what you're doing with wages, what parts of inflation are most challenging and how do you see that evolving? Those would be some questions that we would ask. Our board gets together 8 times per year. And it's not a coincidence that it's 8 times. We get together 8 times because there are 8 FOMC meetings. So Federal Open Market Committee, that's the group that decides on interest rates. And our input that comes from our board of directors that every other office across the Fed is doing the same thing funnels into this broader discussion that supports the monetary policy discussions in Washington, D.C. So we work with our board, and it just so happens we have a board member who lives in Scottsbluff, and he is finishing his service with us this year. So we are doing some activities here in Scottsbluff this week. I've had the opportunity to interact a little bit in Chadron in the past, and it's been a while since I've last been to Chadron State. So we thought that this would be a good chance just to visit with students and faculty, but primarily in the business area because that is most specifically aligned with the kinds of things that we think about regularly at the Fed. I'm going to stop talking there for a minute because I'm curious what questions people might have it can go back to where I started of what you think about the Fed and why, or other things that maybe you heard that you're curious about, and it doesn't have to be specifically economics or monetary policy or inflation or interest rates. We can talk about some other stuff. I am very curious, especially for those of you that are in any of the majors that we talked about of business, accounting, finance, ag biz, whatever it is, as you're thinking about jobs, I'm curious to have a discussion with you on that too, because this is obviously something we think a lot about. I mentioned our role in jobs and the labor market in general. But even from the perspective of the Fed, thinking about us as an employer too, I'd be curious what sorts of things might be top of mind. So I'm gonna maybe stop talking for now and see what questions people might have, or if there's others. Nicholas, if you've got questions that you think would be good to.
Young, what is your biggest concern with the Nebraska economy right now?
If I had to put it at just one, and if I had to say something that would represent a concern that would be statewide, because that's challenging, right? Omaha is a different place than the panhandle of Nebraska. But if I had to boil that down to one thing, I would say demographics. Demographics would probably be the overarching concern or question, but it plays out in a different way in Chadron than it does in Omaha. So in a place like Chadron or Scottsbluff, population growth has been challenging for a long time. And maintaining population growth or addressing the things that need to be addressed to make sure that this type of community continues to have opportunities to grow, that could be a challenge. The United States as a country, and the US is not alone in this, has been struggling with an aging population for a long time. The quote unquote baby boomer generation that approaches retirement. And so the question is, well, if that generation is retiring and we're seeing slower population growth, then where are the opportunities for additional growth, and how do you maximize those opportunities so that a particular community or area doesn't start to go into decline? That would be one of the challenges. But I mentioned demographics and playing out differently in different places because in Omaha, the population is growing, at leaps and bounds like you might see in other parts of the country, but it's been growing. But demographics is still a challenge there because when you talk to businesses, and I just mentioned this in a meeting before this, for probably at least the past 8 to 10 years, when I've talked to CEOs and business leaders across the state, the most common comment by far, when I ask them the things that have been challenging for them, it's been finding labor. That has been the most significant comment. So that's good news for all of you looking for jobs. It has been good news because it's been a strong job market. But it's challenging when it comes to demographics for that different reason. Unemployment is pretty low across the state. It's low in Omaha and it's low here. But it's low in those different places for different reasons, but a lot of them do tie back to demographics. So I would say that's probably one. We could go a lot further into other things, but that's probably the first thing I'd highlight.
Other questions?
Yeah, in the back.
What's your strategy to counter high interest rates? Is there such a like on highs right now?
So the question was strategies to counter high interest rates. So interest rates would be a tool that the Federal Reserve has to try to affect the two things that I mentioned. It would be to try to promote maximum employment, but to provide price stability. So interest rates would be a tool to affect those things. And it's so in and of themselves, interest rates is not the goal, it's the tool to affect the goal. So in this case, inflation. So interest rates are admittedly high, at least by recent standards. And the thing that we would want and need to see in order for interest rates to start to come back down primarily is inflation. The Federal Reserve has a goal for inflation to be 2% over the long term. And, during the peak of the years after the pandemic of inflation, depending on what measure you use, that got up to about 7 or 8%. In other countries, 7 or 8% doesn't sound like a lot, but when your goal is 2%, 7 is a lot higher than 2. And so the goal for the Fed is to see inflation start to move back sustainably toward that 2% target. When it does, if and when it does, let's say when, I think we can be confident when, then you would start to see interest rates come down. So the comment earlier about Jackson Hole, I can go into more detail on that, but Jay Powell gave a speech on Friday morning that kind of gave the first glimpse into likely seeing some reductions in interest rates because there's a growing confidence that inflation is moving back to that target.
Is that gonna cause a cutting rates next month then?
So that's the speculation right now. You're on top of all these headlines on rate cuts. So the big speculation in financial markets has been if and when the Fed will cut rates. Markets and the stock market in particular tend to pay a lot of attention to the stuff that the Fed's going to do. What I will say is that it's not always the reverse. The Fed doesn't always pay as much attention to what the stock market, that's not our goal. Our goal is not to affect the stock market by itself. I mean, our goal is to think about, it's back to the two things that I mentioned earlier. That's what we would call the real economy. We're trying to affect the real economy, jobs and other things along those lines. So the question about rate cuts has been something that has been top of mind for lots of people that are investing in things or in the stock market or otherwise for the past year and a half because interest rates have been as high as they have been. So he went, for those of you that may have seen any of the headlines, he went pretty far into giving a glimpse into the possibility or likelihood that we would see rate cuts soon. He qualified it, I think, by saying, of course, it's going to depend on what the data look like the next 3 weeks, but there would be a next meeting in 2 to 3 weeks. And, that's what markets are going to be focused on is if there's going to be a rate cut then.
I got a follow-up question.
Yeah.
In some of my class, my students will know this analogy, but we talk about an individual that only has the hammer inside their toolbox, and when they pull it out, the entire world looks like a new.
Yep.
Is interest rates, is that the only tool that the Federal Reserve has, or does it have other tools that it can use to impact this inflation number that they're trying to get to?
Yeah, good question. So the tool that the Federal Reserve has that we've been talking about here with interest rates is a very, not just a hammer, it's a very blunt hammer. We don't have the ability at the Fed through monetary policy to affect very specific segments of the economy. We can't, for instance, say, at least by monetary policy alone, you can't say, well, agriculture is in a difficult environment, we're going to affect that industry specifically. What we do is affect interest rates. And then interest rates would be a very, very broad thing that affects all aspects of the economy. So that's essentially the cost of money, right? So when we change interest rates, that's going to make a loan either more or less expensive. And some industries are going to be affected by interest rates very differently than others. You can imagine a business that is in real estate and tied to mortgage rates or something is going to be affected quite differently than some other business that really doesn't have a lot of connection to interest rates. So interest rates is the primary tool. We have some other tools that are often talked about, and one of those, not as much as interest rates, because we supervise commercial banks. There's some element of, through the course of our supervision, that you're either creating or somehow limiting an environment for lending and the risks that banks might take, and then that has spillover into the broader economy. But interest rates would be the primary tool, and we don't have the ability to affect certain topics that might fall under the responsibility of government, and that would be government policy to affect a lot of those things.
More questions? You guys are doing great.
Yeah, the back again.
What is your opinion on current property prices, and are you in any way concerned that a decrease in interest rates might result in a spike in property prices?
In property prices, is that what you said?
Yes.
So property prices and specifically housing prices have accelerated dramatically, I would say, not just since the pandemic, but even going back before the pandemic. The main reason for that is because there are just not a lot of houses available. Interest rates certainly play a role. So when interest rates are low, that means your loan that you're taking out, your mortgage, is going to be a little bit less, and so you can afford a more expensive home. When interest rates are high, it's the reverse, right? If you're going out to buy a house, or if you talk to your parents or whatever that looks like about buying a house, when mortgage rates are where they've been for the past year or two, it's challenging. So mortgage rates, interest rates definitely affect the housing market, but a lot of it has to do with just this is supply and demand. I mean, this is what you learn in economics, is that it's the homes available on the market and people who are in a position to be able to buy those homes. So this is not just a post-pandemic thing that we've been seeing housing prices very, very high. It actually started before that. I actually think a lot of it goes back to some of the conditions that led up to the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. That's really what I think sparked a lot of this. So we would have some concerns, obviously, about the level of housing prices for two reasons. One is the potential that those prices could decline. And if they decline rapidly, that would be bad for a lot of households. Another concern is typically affordability. So there's some communities, and especially as you start thinking about low-income households, they just simply can't afford places, especially with interest rates where they are. So those are a couple of the things that we think about. But so I think your question was, if there was a decline in interest rates, what would potentially happen? All things equal, it would mean that as you reduce interest rates, it would give more incentive and affordability for people to be able to buy houses. And so that would potentially cause house prices to be even stronger than what they are. We really haven't seen a lot of decline in home prices, even with higher interest rates, which has been interesting.
More questions?
Questions from anybody brave enough to talk about what you're thinking of doing after college, or how you're thinking about the job market, or things that you might be wondering about the area that you're interested in? Yeah.
Do you have to have a PhD to work for the Fed?
Thank you for asking that question. And the answer is no, you do not have to have a PhD to work for the Fed. And part of the reason for that, so when you say work for the Fed, there's lots of different jobs that we have available. I mentioned IT. There are people who have degrees in every area of business, finance, marketing, accounting, communications, take your pick. Most of the people who work for the Fed are not economists. I have my PhD in economics, but we only have probably, I'm going to say about 1%. 1% of 20 to 25 individuals at the Kansas City Fed who would have a PhD in economics. We have a lot of people who would have an MBA. And we have a lot of people that have, like I said, an undergraduate degree in some element of business. Doesn't always have to be business. That there would be jobs available, analyst jobs, other jobs that would either be available in Kansas City or Omaha. We have a branch office in Denver, and another office in Oklahoma City. So those are the 4 locations that we have. And so the short answer to your question is no, the majority of people that work for the Fed actually do not have a PhD.
So how did you become, what was your career progression?
Yeah, I had it was mentioned in the introduction that my undergraduate degree is in chemistry. I have a not all that common path toward where I ended up at the Federal Reserve and a PhD in economics. So I'll give you the really short version. My undergraduate degree was in chemistry. I graduated in 2000 and wasn't sure what I wanted to do after college and spent a few years working. Having had that degree in chemistry, moved to Chicago, worked for a few years, still wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And hopefully, by the way, me saying this gives a little bit of encouragement that you don't have to have it figured out. You're gonna learn as you go, and you're gonna try some things, and hopefully you're gonna pursue the stuff that you're most interested in, and then that thing's gonna change, and then you're gonna learn something else and pursue something different, and eventually land on something that you say, yeah, that's the thing I want to do. So I worked for a few years after I graduated college and still didn't know what I wanted to do. Thought that I wanted to go back to graduate school of some form, but I wasn't exactly sure what that might look like. This was when I was in my early 20s, got married in my early 20s. My wife and I at the time had said that before we started having kids and doing other things, and I've got 4 kids, by the way, now. My oldest is 18 and my youngest is 12. Before we started having kids, we wanted to have an opportunity to live overseas and experience living and experiencing a different place. So we spent 3 years before I went to grad school. We spent 3 years living in Bosnia in Southeast Europe, and obviously a very different experience. It was that experience that got me most interested in economics. I lived in a town at the time that had an unofficial unemployment rate of 80%. So poverty was extreme. This was shortly after the war in Bosnia, and there were a lot of people who had left the country during the war that were coming back to that part of the country after the war, but obviously no jobs available, and they're trying to get resettled. So that was a lot of the work that I was involved in at the time in Bosnia. So it was seeing how economics played out on a daily basis for people, even on a really grassroots level, that got me interested in pursuing economics more formally as a graduate degree. I think that economics, I've always been curious about economics. I'm curious about the way the world works. I'm curious about the questions that economics tries to answer. And so I had pursued then that, because I had a degree in chemistry, that's not exactly economics. I had a future economics professor at one point that used to joke with me that at least I knew something about equilibrium when I pursued grad school in economics, a very different equilibrium. So I knew that I was not quite ready for an economics program at a graduate level. So I needed to take some math classes. I needed to take some economics classes to prepare for that. I started in the master's program, would not have been ready at that time to start directly in a PhD program. And did 1 year in the master's and then continued on through the PhD, finished the PhD program. And then as I went through, that's when I started seeing what job opportunities, and this wasn't necessarily the question you asked, but I'll answer it in terms of my interest of joining the Federal Reserve. What I like best about the job is, like I said, I'm naturally pretty curious, and I like to ask questions about what's happening. And being an economist at the Fed gives me the ability to kind of use data to try to answer those questions, but then also interact with the real world to try to answer the question. I get to do a little bit of both. So like I said earlier, our board of directors or visiting with businesses and communities, asking lots of questions, learning about what sorts of things drive the decisions that they make. But then also, we're tied in pretty tightly to the research community, and we do some of our own research to try to answer those questions too. So that was my path. It wasn't the most direct path. But I've been at the Fed now, like I said, going on 13 years and all of that time at the Kansas City Fed.
Now, you mentioned analysts. Can you talk about what those people may do for the Federal Reserve?
Yeah, so of the different areas of work that we have at the bank, so monetary policy would be one of those. We do research. We would have other areas of the bank. We obviously own buildings, and so we have a team that deals with facilities issues. We have technicians, we have people on site that are doing that work. We do, like I said, a lot of work for the United States Treasury, and we interact and do a lot of work with and for banks. In all of those areas, regardless of what the focus is, whether it's managing facilities or whether it's managing a research department, you need people who are working to put budgets together, or people who are communicating things out, or other things that might connect from one part of the work that we do to another part. So analysts would typically be people that are involved in a variety of things, and it would give exposure to broader knowledge about the Federal Reserve. So a lot of times what will happen is people will start as an analyst. Let's say that they start as an analyst in the research. I'm just making something up here. They start as an analyst in the research division. They gain some familiarity with the people and the institution and the processes. They might, in a couple of years, move to an analyst type of position in a different division or a different department, and then gain some familiarity with that area. Maybe in the meantime, and again, I'm just making stuff up here, maybe in the meantime, they decided to pursue an MBA or something else. Now they're gaining a little bit more information and knowledge about financial structure and other things. And maybe they're able to take on a higher level leadership position eventually within the Federal Reserve. Maybe they start managing people. Maybe they become a leader, in the future with the bank. So there are opportunities to move from one area to the next, but analysts would have so working a lot with spreadsheets and communications and, interacting with whoever our customers might be. So those would be some of the primary tasks, but there would be lots of opportunities then to use those skills that get broadened out in other places. Yeah.
How hard would it be to get a job in the Federal Reserve, and what path would a person need to take to get a job there?
My guess is that most of you are doing the right things now, which would be go to your classes, do your work, all those things. If you're pursuing a degree, like I said, in anything that connects to finance and business and some of those areas, you're doing the right things in terms of building knowledge about the institutions that would be relevant to something like the Federal Reserve. Probably my most specific encouragement would be if the Federal Reserve is something that you would be interested in thinking about, to go out and look at the job postings that are there. That would give you a pretty clear indication of the variety of jobs. I couldn't do an adequate job this morning of describing the variety of jobs that you will see out there. They're extremely different from one to the next. There will be a Java developer position somewhere, and there will be a PhD economist position somewhere, and everything in between. Assistants for various projects. So I would, for anyone that's interested, I would encourage you to go out and look at what those job postings are. You can start just with Google Federal Reserve careers, and something will pop up there. If you're interested in a specific location where the Federal Reserve has an office, whether it's Omaha or Denver or whatever it is, there will be postings that will be in some cases specific to those places. But look at the job postings and then read, and obviously read them and try to understand what are the skills that would be best for this position. Now I will say some of the what I've observed in the economics profession, some of the skills that go overlooked sometimes. Economists often come out with a really technical training and know how to work with data, and they know how to do research. And what they don't know how to do very well sometimes is tell other people why they're doing it and why it matters. So some of the skills that get overlooked in those opportunities that specifically focus on business, finance, economics, and other things that are analytical, is that at some point, if the work that you do matters at all, you got to tell somebody else about it. And you got to be able to say it in a way that they can understand it. And you need to be able to explain it to somebody that's in 5th grade. And then you need to be able to explain it to a CEO that's got 3 minutes of your time. So there's a lot that goes into communication skills and some other things that might not necessarily be the standard coursework that you go through, but being well-rounded in those areas will give you a leg up. I would go one step further to say, and this is probably a little bit of my soapbox that I would say to anybody, and I say the same thing to my kids: get involved in something, but more specifically, lead it. If you can get involved in something here on campus, and in some ways, I mean, it doesn't really matter what, obviously do what you're most interested in. But if you can get involved and engaged in it and you can lead that thing, whenever you put that on a resume, so I look at resumes frequently when we're looking to hire people, whether it's a PhD economist or whatever it is. I won't give any specifics as to who this was. One of the things that, not that you would know who it is anyway, but one of the things that caught my attention in evaluating a resume at one point was this individual was the president of their graduate student association. And that doesn't necessarily have a lot to do specifically with training in economics, but it has everything to do with how that person might be positioned to stand in front of a group or to lead a thing or to build consensus. Some of these other things that we talk about as soft skills. So my encouragement would be for anyone, whatever you're doing, lead it. It's hard. It's really hard to lead something, but having the experience doing it will benefit you in whatever it is that you're trying to pursue, whether it's a job at the Fed or whether it's a job anywhere. Any future employer is looking to hire you not just for who you are right now, but ultimately the person, manager, leader, whatever it is that they think you're eventually going to be. Yeah.
Do you think what kind of personality to fit for Federal Reserve?
There's no one personality. I guess my hope is that you would have the best possible outcome is that you would have a diversity of perspectives, values, opinions, beliefs, and all of that together. I think gives the best environment for innovation and creativity. You wouldn't want everyone to come from one particular kind of background because, then groupthink starts to take over and, ideas don't get as creative if you don't have differing backgrounds. So I don't know if there's a specific personality. I would probably just go back to the skill sets of different things. I mean, obviously having strong technical training on things helps, being able to work with data and having familiarity with whatever platform it is that you want to use. And it doesn't have to be Python or stuff that's super complicated, but just having training in that helps alongside though the other things that I would describe as those soft skills. But definitely communication and leadership would be two things that I would put toward the top. Yeah.
What would be your take on using financial leverage to start a business, like a quick startup?
Say that again, my take on financial leverage to start a business. High risk, high reward. I guess that's what I would say. If you're taking on leverage, what that means is essentially you're taking on debt to start something. And the reason that you would do that is because you believe that you're going to be better off in the future, repay the debt, and now you have a business that you can grow. It's in a lot of ways, it's kind of the fabric of how the US economy was created and allowing for small businesses and Main Street to grow when you don't have the resources to start something. So you have opportunities, for example, to take out a loan, or that's a simple way of saying leverage. I'm not sure if that's what you mean specifically, but basically taking on debt to try to grow something. The risk, of course, is that that can be tricky to decide what the right balance is. And if you get over your head and ultimately the prospects of that business or whatever it is, if they don't turn out the way you planned, now you still got to repay the debt and then you're in trouble and you're maybe further back from where you started. So I say high risk, high return in the sense that if you've got a great opportunity and a great idea, you could name off lots of businesses that started in somebody's garage and eventually they needed money to grow it. And now it's a, multi-billion-dollar industry or business. But you can also think of other examples where that didn't pan out and now somebody's got to repay debt and it has lots of implications beyond just one individual then. I would say maybe I'll make this my caution. How many people invest in the stock market? Okay, so good. That's great that you're involved in it. I would say just do it. Be careful because it's a good way to obviously earn income and be smart with money. It's also a way that you can lose a lot of money and develop habits too. So I would just say it's a good thing to be involved in. Just be cautious with it. Yeah.
So do you have any plan for involving cryptocurrency market?
So we get this question quite frequently about cryptocurrency and what our take is on it. And I'll give you kind of my own view and then I think what the Fed view is. So first there's a lot of different, obviously, cryptocurrencies. Bitcoin is one, but there's lots of others. And I think that what I would say at the Fed is there are probably benefits to a digital currency and thinking about sparking new innovation and ways of doing things that are more efficient, faster, et cetera. There are also risks associated with those things. So I think that there are merits of the different cryptocurrencies in moving the way that we do payments forward that become maybe even more electronic and high speed. But the caveat to that, I would say, is that a starting point for the Fed has always been to say that we want stability too. You don't just want to spark innovation and then cause this huge run up in something only to see something collapse and now that's not a viable thing. My own view on Bitcoin, I guess I would say as an example of a cryptocurrency, and like I said, there's lots of others, is that I don't know that it represents what a lot of people think that it does represent. I think that it's something that people put money into because they're hoping it's going to go up in value. But it's not actually used in a physical sense as much as what people might think, in part because there are other cryptocurrencies and there's other ways of paying for things. I'm sure most people in here have used Venmo or other third-party apps for payments. The whole payment landscape is evolving, and I think that it's in part evolving because of the rise of cryptocurrency. So cryptocurrency is something I think that has pushed payments forward, but with a specific example like Bitcoin, I don't know that that's the end thing, and it's extremely volatile. That doesn't help. It's hard to think of it as an actual currency when it doesn't really meet the properties of what we think about all currency should meet.
Take one more question.
I know at 50 minutes, people start to walk out, so I'm well aware of that reality.
Yeah, you got one last one?
Would you say that there is a large amount of agreements between different boards or branch offices in the Federal Reserve about the direction the economy should be moving or like what steps should be taken? Or would you say there's a lot of disagreement?
So that is actually, you maybe didn't know it, that's a fantastic question to ask. And it goes to a lot of the structure of the Federal Reserve and things that we're actually talking about a lot now. And I'll keep my answer short though, knowing that's the last question. What I would say is that it goes back actually to the comment that I made about diversity. The best structure I think that you could have for policy discussions is to have people come in with their own views and the freedom to be able to assert their own opinions. And then have a format where that can happen in a free way where everybody feels free to be able to share their thoughts. You would not want everybody to come in thinking one specific thing and maybe they're all wrong. And then nobody had shared a counter view to be prepared for something else. So with respect to monetary policy, and I guess that's where I'll answer the question, because I would answer it differently on some other things. With respect to monetary policy, you very much want people having different views that are shaped by either the regions that they're representing or, you know, the industries that they're familiar with, so that all of those views then are included in part of the discussion. Now, there's lots of dynamics here that we could go into. You know, how much influence does Jay Powell or the chair have over how other people think? How is he setting the precedent in his meetings that he's running for others to have the freedom to be able to share their views? Those are important questions. But the short answer to the question there, especially as it relates to monetary policy, is that the structure of the Fed is intended to encourage as much debate and dialogue and differing views as possible. At the end of the day, there has to be one policy that comes out of that. You can't have different interest rates. So there still is a consensus that's formed and then a policy that is applied. But everything that leads up to that point is hopefully intended to be a free debate and discussion. And, you know, again, the idea there being that that's the best way forward to encourage as many ideas as possible. Good question.
That was an excellent question. Everybody, would you please give Dr. Kauffman a hand?
Thank you all. And, you know, back to the earlier questions and comments too about the Fed as a potential employer, please, you know, ask somebody about it, or, you know, even reach out to somebody from the Fed. You know what, I've for students that are really interested in, for example, economics, I'm always glad to talk. And what are some of the questions or things that you're thinking about? So, you know, don't feel that there needs to be some sort of brick wall that you can't. I know you're all going to be experiencing this and it seems uncertain and all of that going forward, but consider the Fed as an option, and if not, at least hopefully you've learned a little bit more about it, what some opportunities might be out there. So thanks again for taking that.
Thank you, Dr. Kauffman. Those of you that are in my class, come down and sign in for me, okay?
Those in EIS 332, did everybody sign the sheet? No, I don't know. Awesome. 12:30. You're in.
Got this crap tomorrow if you wanna go. I wasn't like Nebraska there.
No,
Why?
when you come back.
Cardio.
Yeah. Yep.
It's only 4 p.m. So you're here.
I didn't know. Sorry, thanks.